the stone wall. My grandfather lived with us until I was about 8, and I wonder sometimes just how long it will take me to shake loose all the scarred parts of my brain from the things he told me. Because of him, I'm afraid of water, afraid of rustling leaves, afraid of cats that cross my path, and several things I can't say out loud, they frighten me so much. As a boy, I was terrified to leave the back steps, afraid to go anywhere near the short retaining wall that ran along the back of the yard. My mother and her friends laughed at me when I'd sit on the steps, cowering. But my grandfather didn't tell her the story he told me. Maybe he said the same things about cats and leaves to everyone, but I think he only told me about the garden wall. Maybe he only needed to tell one person. And I just happened to be there when it needed telling. He built the wall for Mom not long after he moved in when I was just a baby, so she could have a place to plant the sunflowers she loved so much along the tall back fence. The wall held up the dirt of a little hill so it didn't wash into the yard, and it had to be tall enough so her sunflowers could look over the fence at the sun all day. It was just an ordinary cement wall about 3 feet high. On top was a row of flat rocks he'd found across the street when it was still a big field, before the new houses went up the year I turned 7, and we got lots of new neighbors and look-alike houses. Later, my friend Jimmy moved in over there, and I could go to his house as much as I wanted to and play in his yard that didn't have any walls. My dad used to have a friend too. His name was Bob, and he lived next door. I don't remember him because he disappeared one day, but my folks talk about him now and then. I think my dad keeps hoping he'll show up again one day and tell him where he went and why, but I don't think he's coming back. My friend Jimmy doesn't think so either. Not after I told him what Granddad said about the wall. I was big into Robin Hood the summer I was 7. I was wearing my Robin Hood costume that night. I remember feeling very brave when I put on the green tights that came up to my armpits and my mom's green sweater and one of my dad's belts going twice around my waist. But I was itchy and hot, and I only wanted to go inside and take the sweater off when I walked up the front steps. I remember it was after supper, and I noticed too late that my grandfather was sitting on the front porch. I usually tried to avoid him, but he was sitting out there in the dark with the porch light off, smoking a cigarette. Mom didn't let him smoke in the house, so he sat outside a lot. I always picture him sitting outside, even when it was cold or raining. Anyway, I just remember him looking at me and telling me to sit down and he'd tell me a story. He had that tone in his voice that said I'd better do it. So I sat down in the dark on the floor of the porch across from him, sitting on the swing chair we used to have out there. His long legs were flung out nearly across the porch, and he slouched so low his head seemed half down his chest. There was light coming through the window behind him, and I could hear the television on in the living room. I could picture Mom and Dad sitting there and knew they couldn't be coming out to rescue me until the show was over. After I sat down, I remember he didn't say anything for a long time. I sat there and itched. And then I must have said something because I remember the next thing he said was, "You think you're so smart. People always think they're so smart." Then he took another drink from his glass and stared at me. He finally looked away. That neighbor of ours, he thought he was smart too. Bob. What kind of name is Bob? Why couldn't he be Robert, like a decent man? Bob. He was always snooping around here, acting like he belonged. My grandfather fell silent again, and I sat there, watching him drink and smoke, looking out at the street. I hoped he was done so I could go inside. Even then, I already knew that his stories usually made me more afraid, and I hated it when he told me things. But this night, he seemed even scarier than usual. I tried to wiggle to scratch my back against the post I was leaning against, and then he started talking again. He was going to tell me, you see, Bob, the fool. My grandfather made a hissing sort of sound deep in the back of his throat. Before I had to move here, I was somebody, you know? I used to work for the big boss in town. He was something, I tell you. You're just a kid, but if you'd seen me then, even you would know I was important. I had nice suits and a car, a really nice car. When you're important, people look up to you and treat you good. Not like now, an old man, what a life. Riding out here in the suburbs, living with my daughter. That even here, they should respect me. They know what I once was, and they're afraid of me, and they should be. He leaned down and filled his glass from a bottle of whiskey on the floor by his shoe that I hadn't seen until then. That neighbor, Bob, he should have been more afraid of me. But he thought he was so smart. I thought I could make a little money, you know? So I could get another car and maybe move back to the city and get away from all this suburbia. Granddad waved his hand at a little moth flying around his head. So I sold a car from down the street. Big deal. I had a guy lined up to buy it already. He came by one night to get it. He knew the score. He knew there was something funny about buying a car at midnight, but he was from the city, from my other life, and he knew I'd give him a good deal. That night before he showed up, I went down the street and got the car I wanted to sell him. It was easy. I'd seen how that idiot always left his keys in the car. People do that out here in the nowhere suburbs, where they think it's safe. He was so afraid he'd lose his key in his new fancy red Impala coupe. Ooh. He just dropped the key on the floor of the car when he got out. There was the only one like it in the neighborhood. He was so proud of that damn car. Granddad took another long drink and then filled his glass up again. I could smell the whiskey now. Anyway, so that night, before Lucky Tim was to get here, I strolled over, rolled the smart guy's car out of the driveway and pushed it along here in the dark. And when Lucky Tim showed up, I sold it to him, like taking candy from a baby. My grandfather lit another cigarette. and the flare of the light hurt my eyes. I sat very still now. He was telling me something very bad. The smell of tobacco added to the smell of the whiskey, and my green legs flickered faintly in the light coming through the window. I didn't feel brave anymore. I knew I'd never want to dress up as Robin Hood again. He shut his eyes and stopped talking while he smoked. I wasn't even sure he remembered I was there, but he picked up talking again after a few minutes. It was all very smooth. No problem. No one would have known a thing, except I seen that nosy little friend of your father's. He was walking back from the park with his dog just as Lucky Tim drove away in that pretty little coupe. Now, what Bob was doing, walking his dog at midnight, I don't know. But there he was, his eyes as big as plates, watching his neighbor's automobile driving off in the middle of the night, and me standing there smiling, waving goodbye to it. He turns those big eyes on me, and I says to him, "Good evening, Bob. What you think about that, huh?" He looks at me, and he's working his mouth around to say something stupid, I could tell. "There's no harm in it now," I says to him. "Tell you what, I'll share the profits with you. I'll give you $50 and you never saw a thing. What do you say?" See, kid, I knew that he had really been wanting to get one of those new barbecue things that's all the rage these days. He wanted not just any barbecue. He wanted one of them fancy ones. He told your dad, but his wife wouldn't let him. So now I says to him, "You can get that new barbecue and nobody has to know a thing about it." I could see him weighing up the thought in those little sneaky eyes of his. He always was one of those little weasels that acts real nice to your face, but then gets what he can behind your back. Your dad never could see the kind of fool he was. He looks up at me and I could see those sneaky wheels turning in his head. And he says, "Well, Joe, if you make it 100, I think I could forget what I just saw." He thought he was so smart. He knew he had me over a barrel, but I knew he was selfish enough to know a good thing when he saw it. So I said, "Tell you what, Bob, I'll make it 75, and I won't hurt you when I give it to you." How's that for a deal? He lost that little grin he was sporting and nodded his head up and down. I gave it to him, and off he went to his house, safe as you please. But I got to thinking about it and wondered if I could count on him. The cops were all over the place asking questions when that car turned up missing the next day. And although I didn't see that weasel talking to anyone, it bothered me to wonder about it. So I called Lucky Tim again and told him I needed just a little favor in return for the good deal I'd given him on the car. I told him what I needed, and he said it sounded like fun. So, the next night, when Bob took that little stick he called a dog out for a walk, Lucky Tim was hanging around in the park. He pretended he was a friend of the guy who lost the Impala and offered him a fat $50 bill to tell him if he'd seen anything pertaining to the stealing of the car. Well, old smart Bob, he takes that 50 into his pocket and points right at this house here, quick as you please. He must have felt like a lucky man, profiting twice for doing nothing but walking that dog at the right time of night. Lucky Tim told me all about it when I paid him back the 50 he'd given that two-timing weasel. Well, your mom had been at me to help her get a little garden going so she could put in those big yellow flowers she's so fond of. So I got me some cement mix in that big wheelbarrow, and I went to work the next day. I wondered how to arrange it, but I got lucky. Your mom took you. You were no more than a baby then. She took you out for the day with Bob's wife. And I went over to ask that weasel to come help me push that wheelbarrow around. You know, since we're such good chums now. You should have seen the look on his face when I hit him the first time with that shoe. I'd be willing to bet just as I hit him, he was thinking of new ways to blackmail me. Or maybe he was just listening for a cop car out front, thinking I was just about to be busted and taken away since he ratted on me and it was just a matter of time. Wow! I stuffed a rag in his mouth. Then, one at a time, I broke his legs and both his arms. That way, I could fold him neatly into the wall form and cover him up with that cement. I left his eyes open while I went and got that dog of his and stuck him in the wall. Because his wife would know he'd never go anywhere without him. His eyes bugged out of his head when he saw me break its little neck before I tucked him in under one of his arms. They're both in there now. They're bones, holding up your mom's flowers. Oh boy. Sometimes when your dad is talking about his good friend Bob and how much he misses him, he's sitting right there on that wall, right over him. It makes me laugh, except that I didn't seem like I could take it. It about makes me laugh, except then it didn't seem like I could take off right away with my profits until all the hubbub died down about the stolen car and the missing neighbor. If I'd left then, it wouldn't have looked good. So I got stuck here for another year until people got tired of talking about what a dangerous place this neighborhood had gotten to be, and they started talking about other things. And by then, my blasted heart was so bad, I figured I might as well die here than out there on my own somewhere. Grandfather flicked his glowing cigarette butt hard over my head onto the lawn. How long does it take a guy to die out here anyhow? My grandfather had finished his bottle of whiskey by now, and he slumped into the swing seat. I sat still for so long that my legs had gone to sleep, and when I moved, the filling in them made me groan. Granddad roused himself and said to me, "So kid, just so you know, if you go telling on me, you could find yourself wrapped in stone, just like Bob there. You think on that when you go to sleep tonight." Then he sort of leaned over and rested his head against the swing's chain, and a minute later, he let out a snore loud enough to set the neighbor's dogs to barking. After that, I swear I could see a face in the wall whenever I went out there. There were 3 sort of dents and a little bump close together, and I thought it looked like someone screaming. I was just a kid, so of course, I told my mom what he'd said about Bob being in her wall, but she laughed and said he was just fooling around. But when she asked him about it, he gave me one of those looks he had that made my stomach ache so bad I couldn't eat dinner. I could tell he liked it that his daughter stood up for him and didn't believe me. So he must have decided his secret was safe in spite of me. He called me a little weasel, though, after that, and said he was going to start on another garden wall someday. And I never said a word about it after that, until I told Jimmy years later. But he couldn't hurt me now, even if I tell everybody. When I was 8, he finally had that heart attack he was waiting for. Sitting right there on that wall over Bob and the dog. I guess there was a sort of justice in that. I like to think that it made Bob smile anyway.